Hey everyone, I'm Matt, and welcome to the Good Trouble Show. I want to wish you and your family a happy Easter, and thank you, of course, for spending your Easter Sunday with us. We've got a really great show today, and we are honored to have a legend in the UFO UAP world who will be joining us very shortly. But first, please hit the subscribe and thumbs up button on YouTube. You can also find us on Twitter at Good Trouble Show and all other social media platforms at, let's see here, The Good Trouble Show. We always appreciate a comment, share, like, give a thumbs up, and subscribe, all of that stuff. You can also find us on your favorite podcasting platforms. Just search for The Good Trouble Show. And if you really want to throw some support in, you can become a member of Patreon. And for the price of a coffee, you can go to www.patreon, where is it? It's screwing up there. Patreon.com there it is. Patreon.com/The Good Trouble Show. And for the price of a coffee, you can show your appreciation for our work. I also want to thank our financial supporters on Patreon and YouTube, our chat moderators who volunteer their time, especially on this Easter Sunday, and of course, everyone who supports our show. Now, today's guest is an author and retired colonel of infantry who has held key positions in special operations, intelligence, and research and development. At Los Alamos Labs, he played a crucial role in developing non-lethal warfare and has authored books on national security and, of course, the UFO phenomenon. Please welcome Colonel John Alexander. How are you, Colonel? Oop. Oh, sorry. Let me unmute you again. Hold on one second. We are off to a rip-roaring start here. Looks like my mic is not unmuted. Let's see. Hold on one second. Okay. Now I think I have you. No, I don't have you. Okay, hold on one second. Still, are you there now? Hold on one second. We always have, unfortunately, these little technical difficulties here and there. And let's see. How about now? Oh, man. I'm batting 1,000 today. Okay, hold on one second. I'm going to reconnect this. Have my staff of one running the show here. All right, they have you now. Oh man, okay. I am not sure what is going on here. I had you literally seconds ago. Hold on one second. How about now?
Yes. Are we
there we go. Okay.
Well, that's Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will, and at the most inopportune time.
Of course. Yeah, it's always something here. Let me get rid of this. Yeah, hopefully one day someone will actually produce this show professionally rather than me doing it out of my home office. But I appreciate your patience and everyone's patience, of course. Firstly, happy Easter, Colonel. How are you today?
Well, we're doing pretty good, and you?
I'm doing well. I'm just going to turn your volume up a little bit more here. Yeah. Other than a little few technical hiccups here on the show, I'm doing absolutely great. So let's jump right to it. So firstly, Colonel, thank you, of course, for joining us on a Easter Sunday, and actually, really, most importantly, thank you, sir, for your service to this country. And before we get into the anomalous stuff, UFOs and paranormal and all that kind of stuff, you had quite an esteemed history in the military. And for those of our viewers that aren't familiar with your background and what you've done in service for our country, I would love to hear a bit about that.
Well, I left college early. I thought it'd be fun to go jump on an airplane, so I enlisted in 1956. Spent a fair amount of time. I was eventually E7, that's Sergeant First Class, and got sent off to OCS, and became an officer. And then, as you indicated, spent a lot of time in various areas. The intelligence stuff, I'm sure we're going to go into in the weird science area. As you said, I was Special Forces, made Southeast Asia from 66 to 69, commanding Special Forces A teams there. Number of other assignments and schools, and completed my doctorate while I was on active duty at my own expense, I might add. But yeah, and then 1988, retired first time. And that's when I went to Los Alamos National Laboratory, and we'll get into non-lethal weapons, I'm sure. Retired from there formally and came out to Las Vegas with Bob Bigelow, and he was creating the National Institute for Discovery Science, and we'll probably talk some about Skinwalker Ranch and that sort of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
After that, I actually spent a stint in Afghanistan. Kind of the official job title was mentor to the Minister of Defense when Fahim Khan was the minister. This was in 2003, just as the government of Afghanistan was being established. Came back and was a non-resident fellow at a defense university for another decade, and that probably about covers a number of other things in between, but
Awesome. So let's talk about your time at Los Alamos Laboratory working on non-lethal weapons. What are non-lethal weapons, and what was your experience like there?
Well, obviously, weapons that don't kill people. The primary work. What had happened is I had retired and I was running a lot of high-tech stuff in the military. Went to Los Alamos, had been watching, the invasion of Panama, Just Fury and Grenada, and said, damn, we need to look at a different approach, because as many have now said, as they later came along with Iraq, Afghanistan, you can't kill your way out of these problems. And particularly in Panama, was looking at the invasion there. Was very intense warfare for a very short period of time. But the point was we had big families with long memories. And our argument was with Noriega, not with the Panamanian people, whom we wanted to have cordial relationships following it. So how is it that you can apply force on that level and you'd be able to, control things? And my point is, and this is something a lot of folks don't understand. You keep hearing about, the lethal consequences, which are real. But the idea of war is not really to kill the enemy, but to be able to impose will, i.e., get them to do what it is you want them to do. Now, non-lethal, we look at a very, very broad spectrum, from simple stuff about, like rubber bullets, which aren't really rubble, things like pepper ball and tasers, and that's kind of the low end sorts of stuff. Law enforcement dramatically involved in that. And then we get to the high end, what we call strategic incapacitation, i.e., how can I incapacitate a nation state and do that without having to just bomb things, but take out basically the infrastructure is what you're trying to work on there. But to do it in a way that you also don't have secondary or tertiary casualties. So that's when you get into pretty complex kinds of applications.
Now, tonight, actually, 60 Minutes, they will be airing a story about the Havana Syndrome, and I'm going to play a little clip from this.
A car chase in Florida may have provided the vital clue
Pull over!
to a national security mystery. Many U.S. officials and their families believe they've been injured by a secret weapon in the hands of a foreign adversary.
It's devastating. It's absolutely devastating.
For the first time, we have evidence of who might be responsible.
Are we being attacked?
My personal opinion, yes.
By whom?
Yeah, I think I kind of know who it is, but I'm curious, as someone that has worked in the non-lethal weapons field, what do you think Havana is, or what do you think is the weapon used that is causing this kind of damage?
Well, the short answer would be I don't know. The best guess is it's some kind of microwave weapon. And I understand how to do that. What I do not understand about all of the applications and things we've heard is what the targeting mechanism is. How do you get so selective that certain people are affected and other people not? And as you know, well, of course, in that segment, they get into that it may have been applied near the White House, certainly between there and the old EOB or executive office building. And you go, how would you do it in that area? But in other places where certain people are affected, others aren't, some of them affected in their apartments where they're living. This is particularly true, I know, in China. What I didn't mention in the intro was my last assignment was Director of Advanced System Concepts for the Army Laboratory Command. I had all of the tech base, and among things in there was all of the tactical directed energy, which in that time included lasers, microwaves, and we're then looking at charged particle beams. So understood this. Some of it was at that time in the black world. Fast forward few years from then, I was with the National Academy of Science. There was a study that was being done on non-lethal weapons and what could be applied. And so understood what the capabilities were. As you know, at that time, you would know, in 2001, they uncovered one which was called Stingray. And that was a weapon that standoff, but basically it's a microwave weapon that penetrates only a few millimeters in the screen, hits the pain receptors, and can, it causes you to move pretty quickly. Bit of a digression, but I've been shot personally by all of these systems that you talk about, Peggy. You ought to know what you're talking about. And not only that they're non-lethal, but how effective they are. So I've been shot with taser and pepper balls and beanbag bullets and all of that sort of thing. And including something that was called Silent Guardian, which Raytheon was developing at the time, which was kind of a corollary to Stingray. But again, these are direct energy. You've got to have line of sight to the target. That's why Havana syndrome, and it comes up with a number of different characteristics. I just don't understand how they target, because it clearly is targeted to certain people, both, now some here in the U.S., which means you'd have to deliver the system, and as well as ones that are abroad, where we've had our embassies and embassy personnel that have taken. Of course, it's called Havana syndrome. It's much broader than that, but that's because it kind of was first noticed in the Cuban embassy in Havana.
Yeah, I actually have a friend of mine that was very high up in the Trump administration, and she was hit by Havana while she was walking, I think, from walking to the West Wing. And it was interesting. I was visiting D.C. in the spring at dinner with this individual, but I was also staying with a friend of mine that's a U.S. Secret Service agent. So I was telling him about this, and he scratched his head. He of course he couldn't elaborate, but he just didn't understand how that weapon, standoff weapon, could be anywhere in the vicinity of the White House without it being detected. So I've often wondered too if perhaps this thing has been deployed on some space-based platform, so it is truly as standoff as it can get.
No, I would venture to say it's not space-based because you've got distances and you have an arc, a cone that goes out because the beam would spread. And this is very, very specific. So it's in relatively close range, whatever it is. Would be disconcerting, and you got to agree with Secret Service. I mean, the environment, including the electromagnetic environment, is definitely carefully monitored in those areas. And what we have, as far as I know, have not picked up is what's the frequency. Now, the one that I mentioned, Stingray, that's at about 95 gigahertz. And there are other phenomena that have been noted. You can use this for information transference. So you can talk to you, silently. So if you have somebody going out, you want to talk, but you talk to them. It's not a two-way conversation. But again, as far as I know, all of them are line of sight. And so, given what you described and what we heard in the 60 Minutes of them being near the old EOB, that's something that's operating very close. And frankly, you could probably put such a system, in a vehicle and drive, relatively close. But again, it's line of sight. And if you know the ellipse there, you can stand off quite a ways. And have direct line of sight in some of the areas. I will say I've heard of the ones I think in China in particular, where they were being affected in their living quarters, which was not in the embassy, but they were living near Beijing. I have friends who are working on the technical capability, and I suspect that the culprit might be surprising and might not be a nation.
Interesting. So why do you think, clearly, and my friend that still suffers from the effects of Havana syndrome today, you've got all these journalists and debunkers that have said it's a mass hysteria event, which I think is just absolutely ridiculous. So let's say for a second that Havana syndrome is real, which I believe it truly is. What reason do you think the CIA or whatever three-letter agency would cover this up? Because I think it was about a year ago they came out and said, this is, there's nothing to it, et cetera. What, from a national security lens, Colonel, why do you think they would try and hide this?
Well, I'm not going to cover them. I mean, the people I know actually work with that agency from a technical perspective, and they're looking pretty hard. Now, some of it's covering their ass because if this is real and, we're now looking at medical benefits and things that might come on. One of the surprising aspects, let me go back to Stingray, and again, having been shot by that, when you turn it off, the symptoms stop immediately. I mean, you can turn it on, you catch it pretty quickly. When it's turned off, it's immediate. And most of the other ones that I'm aware of, do not. But this seems to have lingering effects, and ones that Olivia was talking about as obviously one of them, where which would indicate probably some kind of neurological damage that's being done. And we don't see that with the weapons that at least I'm familiar with. Got to admit, I'm quite dated. As I said, I retired in '88, and technology has moved considerably since that time, particularly the power dynamics, where you've got to be able to send this at some distance. That, and with, of course, lasers as well as microwaves, has increased very, very substantially since I was working with it.
I suspect on this 60 Minutes report that, they're going to lay it all out, that this is indeed real. People have suffered long-term health consequences of that. And I think what'll be obvious to everyone is that the United States government has covered it up, similar to, in my view, what has happened with the UFO UAP topic. Does all of this secrecy in covering up the existence of UAP or Havana syndrome, does all of this do nothing but further erode the public's trust in government?
Well, you've asked a number of different questions in there, but the bottom one, lack of trust, is absolutely real, and that's why if we get into the UFO or UAP arena, I think that's one of the detrimental issues, and always has been. And that is the denial of something that's obvious. Now, there's many reasons for that. One of them, frankly, not just egotistical, but don't like to deal with things you don't have good answers for. I mean, that's just, and particularly governments are supposed to, they're supposed to answer questions, not leave the public in a quandary. It's supposed to be omniscient and nowhere close
know
to
everything,
it.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So let's say that this turns out to be Russia, and clearly there's been targeting of leadership and diplomats and whatnot. Would that be considered an act of war?
Now that is a very, very tricky question, and particularly now if you translation to this to cyber, and that is what constitutes an act of war. In this case, I mean, you've got beams that are being, transferred. I can raise this to a bigger issue: is what is war? And particularly now, we used to have wars of attrition. Country invades another country, and that's pretty obvious. You go back to wars of annihilation, such as World War II, which was the last time you did it. But a question has always come up is, particularly with terrorism, where is terrorism? Where does it become low-intensity warfare? When does it, and people academically, they have all kinds of philosophical discussions on that. None of them are simple. But, if somebody threw a stone at a diplomat, is that an act of war? Probably not. But again, where is crime? Where is terrorism? Where is low intensity conflict? Where is, overt warfare? And a lot of that basically is really political, and decisions as to how one is going to choose to respond. We're having this all the time. As you know, we have incursions many, many times a day by a number of bad actors, and a lot of independent ones, civilians going in and crippling information warfare. That's why they call it IW, information warfare. And at what point do you respond? You also run into huge questions from an intelligence perspective if you notice something happening, do you want to respond, which means you've now told them, we know what you're doing, and we're going to respond to that? Or is there more intelligence value in just watching what they're doing and keeping track of who's doing it? Now, and most of them, I'll point out, interestingly, my son was in my son's very senior in a major law enforcement community here in the U.S., but he was at a conference this week, and it had to do by the National Cyber Command. I forget the exact acronym that the organization, but they were talking about how various governmental agencies at various levels, can be local, state, or as well as federal, as well as all what's happening in the civilian sector. But their point was this was a very nasty attack, denial of service. And when they went back, they found out that the item that had caused this, the virus had been inserted at least 6 months before and remained benign. And then, so what does this mean? Back to your question of what's war. If you find something is benignly sitting there in some, pick any program or company or, governmental computers, is it war when they activate it, or does it, if it just finding it there, is that enough to do it? And then you've got the whole series of serious questions, determine how do you respond to that and what resources. I will tell you in all of these, and pardon me if I'm digressing a bit, when you war game these things, red always wins. And the point there is that the protective measurements, frankly, break the bank. And that was certainly true with directed energy. Yes, you can protect and harden all of these systems, and that's true in the information sector as well as directed energy and that. But there's a phenomenal cost, and you could literally drive most countries bankrupt, let alone companies and that, as to, how much is enough in the protective arena.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you think that we might be surprised as to who is actually behind it. What would you like to share your personal opinion of who you think it might be or what it might be?
I was just told not a nation state actor.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Yeah, but so if you look at what's happening, in the private sector, look at what we've done, and cyber is a good way. Most of that, probably 98% of all the technological developments are private sector, not the government. Does the government play a role? Yes, they do. But the real drivers and innovators are in the private sector. We do know that many of the, again, to stay with the cyber warfare or intrusions, many of these are East Europeans and, the former Soviet. By the way, I'll apologize ahead of time. I flipped between Soviet and Russia. That was just based on the adversary in my period. But
Sure.
They are very, very good. And so the questions then become up is how do you respond? Do you step in? Because we've stated, an offensive capability. And now does that, if you start going back and forth, now are we at war? What are the parameters? And no easy answers.
Definitely no easy answers. So let's shift gears and let's talk about the UAP UFO phenomenon. What got you interested in that topic? And the paranormal as well.
Yeah, well, for the audience's sake, or anybody who hasn't told me, they should know that one of my basic principles is that this is not a single phenomenon. And in all the briefings that I have a slide up there that says it's got UAPs as one, but it also gets into near-death communication, after-death communication, psychokinesis, interspecies communication, and even into we call cryptozoology. And my view is that consciousness is the key piece of this, and it transcends all of them. And we kind of do a disservice when we try to say, just establish parameters of what's acceptable or not. In the broadest sense, I start with saying, what do you mean by UFO? I'll use I use the UFO term. I understand why they did it the other way. But we got little balls of light, got hard craft, literally miles across, and thousands of variations in between. So what are your parameters of what you're going to accept? For a long time, orbs, for instance. If we go into that, everybody says, well, that's kind of different, that doesn't out. And now people are saying, well, no, that probably, in my view, it is certainly part of the phenomenon.
That totally makes sense. So I'm curious, when you were deployed back in your active service days, like for instance, when you were commanding special forces in Thailand and Vietnam, did you ever encounter UAP or anything you would consider paranormal?
Well, you should know my camp. I had a special forces camp that was on the Cambodian border. We actually had a Buddhist temple inside. My main interpreter had spent 6 years as a monk, and we discussed these things. Saw similar stuff in Thailand, but any, actual phenomena, no. One of my literally war stories is I was in an area that was in the Delta and Mekong Delta, and a lot of people don't know there were mountains there. It was actually an area called Seven Mountains, and that's where my camp was. And we had companies on top of two of them. And I do remember we were flying into one on a Huey going into the camp. All of a sudden, a black something came zooming out of Cambodia and thumped us and went on. And we were screaming on the radio, and the answer came back as there'll be no discussion of black aircraft. Now, by the way, this is far, far too low to be SR-71, but that's what they were trying to protect at the time. But still to this day have no idea who was flying it or why it would come, like I say, almost right at us, and definitely out of Cambodia. It wasn't flying near the border, and my camp was very, very close to the border.
I'm curious, you've been at this for quite some time. Have you noticed a change in the stigma of the whole UAP topic? UAP, UFO, I mix it up all the time myself. I tend to call them UFOs. Have you noticed a change in the stigma from when you started your military service versus where we are now?
Well, much later. Let me give you two specific examples. And we met at Saul, right?
Correct. Yes, very briefly.
Okay. In I think it was 92, that John Mack was hosting with Dave Pritchard a conference on, this was on the abduction phenomena at MIT. And when we arrived, everybody had to sign a statement that says, this is at MIT, not by MIT. In other words, the institutional dissociation. Where we were, following that, Gary was here at the house, and I was talking to him about this. And he mentioned that this was at Stanford University. And he said, short time before the conference was held, like just a few weeks, everything was set and ready to go. And he gets called in by, I forget the name of the office, but something that protects the brand of Stanford, if you will. And he says, oh boy, he thought he was going to get nailed. I'm X number of weeks out and I'm going to have to find a new venue or something. And they said, no. They said their perspective was, this is a Stanford conference supported by Seoul, as opposed to the other way around. And of course, as you know, Avi Loeb was there, and you saw the same thing with Harvard. So here in a period of 3 decades, you see this huge difference from an institutional perspective. One is, we don't associate us with that. 3 decades later is we want to lead the charge. So I
love that.
That's a huge difference.
That is a very big difference. Have you sensed, or I know you're no longer active duty, have you sensed a change or heard of a change in terms of how this sort of stuff is talked about within military circles?
Not really. I know when you talk to Arrow, they say that that is one of the things that they're trying to do is to decrease the stigma. My view, I doubt that it's totally gone away. And as we would say, this is not something that would necessarily be career enhancing.
Right.
And I had friends with other phenomena that reported it and go, the mainstream is you do certain things. It's a very conservative organization. And getting too far outside the lanes is not good.
Not good. And I think we saw that perhaps with Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick with Arrow. He clearly seemed to stay in lane. Now, so moving on here. So in 1985, you formed the Advanced Theoretical Physics Project. What was that, and what were the findings of this group you put together?
Well, we did what I did with a friend, and we kind of said, we started from a position that Roswell was probably real. The government been working on it for a while, and they probably would like to get the information out. They got a tiger by the tail. How do we get it out? So what we did is at the top secret SCI level, put together an interagency group with all the services. We had various members of the intelligence community, most of the major agencies involved, as well as private aerospace. And again, you had to have the TS SCI tickets to attend, had to be interested, and we had to know who you are. I mean, so this was literally an old boy network at the time. And we said, okay, let's just see where it goes. Now, what I found at the time was quite different from what they're being discussed now. And that was everybody kind of knew all of the generic stuff, but everybody was pointing fingers. I thought you were doing that. No, aren't you doing that? Aren't you doing it? And now, as far as the technological aspects, everything that Lou came up with, the LOSAP and ATIP, we knew all of that. The thing that's different there is sensor systems have improved, so you've got better reading. And they did get to the point where it was okay, at least for in some circles, to talk about it. I mentioned it's very different between talking about it among friends and individuals in these very narrow circuits, as opposed to, remember, what we have across the board are centralized promotion systems. That's why I mentioned before, not career enhancing. So you have to worry about not just this particular sighting or topic that you want to talk about, but if this gets higher visibility, is this going to negatively impact the people who are going to be making decisions about your future, who may or may not be more accommodating.
So it kind of really was sort of no incentive to speak up about this.
Very little. I usually tell people, you want to see the scars? No, I was very fortunate. I can say when I was a lieutenant colonel, I had not done the things that you're supposed to do, and I had done some. We'll talk about the paranormal stuff that's very, very far out. So I mean, my probability of promotion was about zero. And yet I ended up getting promoted, I'd say not because of, but in spite of. But I did there. And again, this is where you get into individual and, I had some very high level people who were supportive. I had some others who would just as soon kill me. I can, most of them have died, and I can tell you who's who, but it's, it was, quite varied.
I can't imagine. So what were some of, because I want to move on to NIDS here in a minute and Skinwalker Ranch, but while you were when you were in active duty, what were some of the other UAP or paranormal related things that you did in the course of your job?
Well, now, in the course of my job, I wanted to say, I didn't have a UAP or a UFO job per se. We did that. I got into a position where I could control some funds. And in fact, I know it's been traded. I used to say, well, I'm a freelance colonel, which is not quite right. But I was in a position where I could, cause these things to happen. I did have a day job, which was not related to these things at all. It was very straightforward on high-tech weapons development and things of that nature. And we did this in addition to, I might add, that one of the requirements when we called it advanced theoretical physics. And the reason for that was the FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act, had just come into vogue. And a lot of people were asking about UFOs, and we didn't think they would ask about advanced theoretical physics. So we used that kind of as a cover name. The other requirement was no notes. So there would be now that was violated, and we now know that from the internet. Some people, I know Oak Shannon's notes are up on there, and some people did go back and write things down. And I did have briefings. I had given briefings at higher and higher levels. I mentioned that I had talked to the director or deputy director of all of those three-letter agencies and others, and response generally was quite supportive. But like I say, we were trying to keep it out. In fact, I had to go. This was one of the things when you're at a certain level and have flexibility, and that's why being a field grade officer is one probably have more flexibility than maybe even being a general. Because I had held a couple of sessions. We held them at BDM, which is one of the big Beltway bandits. And so I finally went back, and I was working for a 3-star general, and who had saved my ass, by the way, because I was under him because the folks back in INSCOM would have killed me if they had had the opportunity. This is when the whole remote viewing program went down and got shipped in. So worse with it. But I finally went and I told them, I said, look, I got to tell you what I've been doing, because I don't want you to hear it from the Washington Post. Something deep. And his response was, well, that's pretty interesting, but we got to go tell my boss, who was the 4-star, other end of the building, who also, by the way, the guy was primarily a logistician. The one I worked for was, it was an Army Materiel Command, so we had both research and development, but the vast majority was on providing logistics to the military and new weapon systems and all of that. And although even he said that, he says, well, that's pretty interesting. Let me know if I can do anything. And I did. I actually took out the opportunity. I said, well, we were going to be at San Antonio, and this was an interagency meeting at the 4-star level. And I was going to be one of the speakers. I forget exactly, but it was definitely basic R&D kinds of things that I had to give the Army briefing on. And I said, but I would like to be handed to your counterpart in the Air Force, which they did. And that was the biggest question is when we went in and they had a small entourage with me there and said, looking around, says, why is this green? Army, as opposed to Air Force. I had an Air Force guy with me, and he sent me off to El Segundo to Space Command. At that time was a 2-star command at El Segundo. So
Wow. Okay. Let's move on to Skinwalker Ranch. Now, so you were part of the National Institute for Discovery Science, founded, of course, by Robert Bigelow. For those of us that have no idea, and I always say too, my knowledge on this UAP topic, I'm very new to it, is like a piece of Swiss cheese with lots of holes in it. So this is very educational for me. So what was NIDS and what were some of the findings of that? What was that experience like?
Well, this is how, and by the way, these things always keep getting intertwined. There's no simple lines. I had first met Bob at that MIT conference that I had mentioned years before, and he was there. It was just a handshake, hi, how are you, Bob? I was hosting one of those meetings that I mentioned at my home. We continued, by the way, after I left active duty. And I was having a meeting at my house, and I was living in Santa Fe, was working up at the lab. And I think Jacques was there, and Hal was there, and some others, the well-known names in the field. And we had been discussing over the weekend, what can we do? And it was kind of a follow-on to what had been done from the military perspective. And phone rings out of the blue, and I pick it up, and it was Sunday morning, and we're getting ready to take everybody to Albuquerque to catch their plane, and he says, hi, I'm Robert Bigelow, and I've heard about you, and I just wonder if any of your people have something that you need funded. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, standing in the kitchen at the moment, and I told some of the people there. He came over, and that started the conversation. And then I was going to retire because the lab was not that interested in, remember, it's a nuclear weapons lab. That's their primary focus. With the technologies are very, very broad, but it was not gaining a lot of traction from the lab perspective on non-lethal weapons. The government on the other side was advancing considerably. And so anyway, then he flies in, and a short time later, calls back and said, well, he's thinking of forming a new institute. And at that time, there still is something called the Santa Fe Institute, which is focused primarily on chaos theory, and Murray Gell-Mann was the kind of their main Nobel laureate who was spawned. So came over, and we introduced him, and he's talking about buying the Santa Fe Institute. They wanted to set one up. I'm going, this is probably not a good fit. You got two guys with big egos. Probably not going to work out. So then he decides that he would create National Institute for Discovery Science, but it was going to be here in Las Vegas, which is frankly the reason that I agreed to come over. So I was the first member of that and came over. It was set up to look at two specific areas. One was continuation of consciousness, i.e. life after death, and the other was UFOs in general. And as you know, I think people know the science board. I brought several of the people in, again, from the national lab perspective. Others like Jacques and Hal were pretty well known. Kit was the first, I think, president of the Science Advisory Board. And we also had two lunar astronauts, Edgar Mitchell, well known, and Jack Schmidt was the other one who was on for a while. So again, we're talking definitely world-class level advisory board.
Sure.
And it was a short time after that, of course, the story came out about the ranch. By the way, it was never Skinwalker Ranch. At least as long as I was with them, it was the ranch. And Skinwalker, the name attachment came later. And so anyway, I'd heard the information about Terry Sherman, name is now known, and that they were having problems. I think there was an article in Deseret News that Bob had picked up on. So started talking to Terry, who wanted to sell the ranch. And by the way, importantly, this is a working ranch, always has been. So it's not like sunk costs where you just lost your money or something like that. So as a matter of fact, we flew up. I flew up with him, and the day that they bought the ranch, he and his executives went to the motel to stay, and I ended up being the first one to spend the night on the ridge, the northern ridge of the Skinwalker ranch. And the rest is sort of history. But again, there were many, many events that happened, and we were able to get in, and again, particularly with the science board, go over a lot of the very high strangeness reports. I can say that Terry Sherman and his wife and family had taken a lot of heat locally in the area, not well received, and we frankly believed, give them high credibility on the very strange events that went on. And then, of course, once it's had the ranch, you have the number of the events that happened to us. Fast forward a number of years, and Bob shut that down. And then later, and I was not involved with OSAP or HF, so that was kind of a continuation. Then, as you know, they sold the ranch, and Brandon Fugal picked it up. And I met with him several times, find them, again, highly credible, seriously interested, and bringing in instrumentation that we certainly never had during the NIDS area. And as I say, the rest is history. How much do you want to know?
So when you were involved with Skinwalker Ranch with NIDS, right, what would you say were maybe like the two most interesting encounters that you had while working there, and that changed your views on the phenomenon itself?
Well, it didn't change my views.
It did not.
But the problem, one of the problems, is that the phenomena keep morphing. And I did come up with the concept that was called the precognitive sentient phenomenon. And by that I meant it, and I don't know how to describe it, but it's an it. And it is in control. We never were. And it would know how we were going to respond before the event ever occurred. And I'll give you one specific, which is one of the biggies that you asked about, one of many. But this is a well-known cattle mutilation. And remember, Terry stayed on as the working manager at that time. And he had come out, I forget the exact time, it's probably posted someplace, but calving season, he came out and finds a newborn calf, and he tags it. What they do is tag it, so it's associated with the cow, and weighs it, takes it. Then he leaves that, and he drives across this open field. Anybody who's seen the TV series knows kind of how open it is. Finds another calf, and so he tags that and weighs that, and he comes back, and calf one's dead. Not only is it dead, it's exsanguinated and eviscerated and lots of stuff. There's an ear has been sliced off, looks like a laser. The tag is missing. No good out. All of it. You can look up the details on it. But this is one where, when I say precognitive, the conventional wisdom was the exsanguination that the blood had run into the ground and just been absorbed there. So George Annette we had I actually had a double doctorate, but was among things at DMV, and so had them go to a slaughterhouse nearby and get blood, and come back and go to another location and pour it on the ground. And you could go by weeks later and you say, "Yep, blood was poured on the ground,"
Wow.
which means exsanguination did not account for that. By the way, not conventional wisdom, the consensus, I think, of the science board was that all of the stuff that had happened, and there's varying amounts, but a lot of material, intestinal material, muscle, because are missing from the cat or cattle or the calf. It's totally mutilated. Our best guess was it didn't happen there. And you go, wait,
what had happened?
Yeah, and we're talking 10 o'clock in the morning, bright sunny day, and all that. Where could it have been taken? And of course, we looked at all of the major predators in the area, and none of them kill anything like what had happened to that particular calf. But it, again, the PSP, your precognitive sentence film, seemed to know how we were going to look at it. And every time, we had cameras that were running 24/7, and you'd find things that would happen just off the camera, or an event would happen. And said, and you start to study, oh, you like that? Try this, and we'd give you just something different. As I said, always morphing, always keeping one step ahead, and I mean, I would recommend the book that George Knapp and Colin Kelleher did, The Hunt for the Skinwalker, because they have even more stories than that. If you want, I'll give you one more that I thought was in the
Please.
wildest of them.
Go for it.
All right. Well, this one, again, we had poles that were about 20 feet high, cameras on top of the pole looking to the west. So we had two poles here, two poles. So the back poles are looking, the cameras are looking at the one up front, about 20 feet high. There's a camera on the platform, is wired, it comes down. They got about half a roll of duct tape, which is kind of key, because anybody who's worked with duct tape knows how that is to work with. Got down near the ground. Then there was a PVC stripe with PVC U-clamps that went underwater or underground back to what they now call the command center. It was just double wide trailers at the time, but again, it was being monitored. This particular day is that, again, the front cameras, up at the top of the pole, wires are pulled loose. All of that duct tape is gone.
Wow.
The U-cams have been pulled loose. Oh, now this gets even better, believe me. B-cam, so we know when the thing was pulled, we know when it stopped recording, so that tells you about when it was. The time-lapse photography is about a second and a third between views. There's a 3-foot chunk of wire that's just been missing. U-clamps are missing. The duct tape is missing. But we know from the time, when did this occur? So you go back and you look what was happening at the time. As luck would have it, at that particular instant, the cattle just happened to be milling around pole one where all of this stuff happened. Now that's key, because normally if anybody or anything approached the cattle, they would scatter. They don't. They just stand there. They don't move throughout the entire period, yet all of these things happen. Also, the back camera that's looking at it doesn't see anything. There's no disturbance. Amazing. And all of that stuff happened, and there's no recording of it when you had a camera staring directly at it during that period. So, like I say, terribly complex. Beyond kind of understanding. And as you know, the beat goes on. I think they're about to go into I know they filmed the next season at Skinwalker Ranch. And, in the last one that was interesting, because they videotaped some balls coming down. This gets into what's a UFO, but orbs coming down that appear to go into the back of the mesa and then come out. Can't say it's the same thing, but you see it come down, hits the mesa, and all of a sudden comes out on the other side and is recorded. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how as strange as you can possibly imagine.
It certainly is. Any idea why this place is a hot spot? For instance, do you think there are portals there? What are your thoughts on why there?
Well, if you watch the sound for Skinwalker, they kept replaying. This was during COVID days, and we did one, and I go, "It's a portal," and that's sort of what it looks like now. It's also important to remember it's not just the geographic boundaries of the ranch. And when you go into history, you find out, like many of these others, you have certain phenomenological events that happen at a particular point, but they're, in second history, you find out that's been going on all along. And that's true here. This goes back at least centuries.
And so coming up, I think it's on this season, you've heard Brandon Fugal and Travis Taylor talk about that there's possibly something big buried underneath the mesa. Would that surprise you if there's actually something there?
Frankly, yes.
It would surprise you.
Watch the program. It would surprise me. Yeah. I would be surprised, because that would also point to a materialistic solution, that there was some object there that has unique electromagnetic or other properties that either creates this or allows it to happen. And I would be surprised, because Skinwalker Ranch is not totally unique. I mean, this has happened various places in the world that have kind of similar sorts of things. And that's one of the things they're doing with the sequel, is looking at other areas.
Would if you were me and I were invited to stay at Skinwalker Ranch, should I do it, or is it best to stay away? I always hear about the hitchhiker effect there.
Oh, hitchhiker effect is real, but having said that, and I've never had anything come back. I do, and some of the others do certain protective cleansing ceremonies in your perspective. But it's like I told Jesse Ventura, he was here filming on this, and he said, "Could you get me invited?" I said, "No." And I said, "Besides, you'd probably be bored." Because you've got, the reason for that is you got to remember, these events all happen. But the ones that I've mentioned and are written up, this is over a period of, years now to decades. So did these big things happen? Is this something that happens like every day and that? No, that's not the way it occurs.
Yeah, that is definitely one interesting place, and I certainly am looking forward to it. And, and Colonel, thanks for joining us. We'll take a little mid-station break here. So, folks, if you're enjoying our interview, please consider subscribing to our channel. And, of course, we always welcome your support by Patreon. You can find the Patreon link and the YouTube description. And we very much appreciate everyone spending their time with us, especially the Colonel here. So So let's move on to the paranormal aspect of this. When I first got into this, I was completely unaware of a relationship or a seeming relationship between the UFO UAP phenomenon and the paranormal aspect of it. And as I've mentioned on this show before, I've experienced both. what are your thoughts on how this is possibly related or why it co-locates?
Well, that's what I said. And one of the interesting things about the findings, I think, from OSAP was that there is a relationship. And you ought not be trying to look just for the pure physical interactions that take place, which are, there's no doubt phenomenal, but that the concept is far broader. And this is kind of my basic theme, is that all of these phenomena are interrelated. As you probably know, I spent more time, actually, among things, I was the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. That came about because when I was about to do my doctorate, I ended up with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's kind of a key figure, both in near-death when Raymond Moody came along. She was already talking about it, as well as bringing hospice to the West. And so, because of that interrelation, I got hooked on. Ken Ring's book had just come out, or one of them. He's done a number now, and IONS, or the International Association for Near-Death Studies, had just come out. And in fact, again, how these are interrelated, you go back to the 1992 study. Now, I'm talking joining in about 82, 81, 82 timeframe. That in the 92 conference that John Mack held, the presentation that I gave at that had to do between the correlation between UFOs and near-death studies. So, I mean, early on, we were, and like I said, I was appreciative when Lou would come up with their studies for, again, the OSAP program, is saying it should not be looked at in isolation, that there's certainly a consciousness component to this. We didn't hit, I don't know if you want to go into it, but the stuff
Sure.
we were doing back at INSCOM with the psychokinesis, I mean, actually teaching it. In fact, sitting kind of one of those pictures right behind me here has to do with, we're doing metal bending and teaching it a trainable skill. I think most people are probably familiar with the remote viewing aspect. And so we were looking at a broad range of topics.
So explain, because a lot of our audience, they do not track the UFO UAP topic, and the remote viewing something is the remote viewing phenomenon, or however you want to categorize it, has always fascinated me. So tell us a bit about what that is and how we think it operates.
Well, I'll skip the second part.
Okay.
How it operates, the short answer is don't know.
You have no idea.
You find, some theoretical aspects to it. Now, first of all, we've had psychics, for millennia, so that aspect is not new. But remote viewing came about from the military aspect of that. And colloquially, you just call that psychic spying. And I use it as data acquisition at a distance. And like near-death studies and UFOs and, say, remote viewing, if we had it to do all over again, you would probably name it something quite different. Because it's more than just viewing. It's not just a pure visual internal response that's getting down. It's total senses as they get involved. So sometimes olfactory senses, tactile senses, etc., that you get involved in this. I don't know where
Where to start.
Where to start on this. This goes back in the late 70s. A military program did get started. Actually, when I was at Command and General Staff College, a young lieutenant colonel, it was not terribly challenging. And so I wrote an article that became quite a controversy. It was called The New Mental Battlefield, and submitted it to the Military Review, which was at Fort Leavenworth and is one of the premier military journals, certainly for the Army at that level. And the story was that I figured there's no way in hell this was going to get published anyway, but I did talk about remote viewing and that, and a lot of us brought on by a book that was popular at the time called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. So, and we were involved in watching what the Soviets were doing, and they had a very extensive program in the area. So I wrote it and I submitted it like, what the hell? And unbeknownst to me and serendipitously, the editor of the journal had a near-death experience, had been out of body, and instead of not just publishing the article, it became the cover article for December 80 issue.
Wow.
Now, like I said, you can't program those sorts of things.
Sure.
So my first assignment after that was as an inspector general at the Department of Army in the Pentagon. And frankly, the article came out, and it was just a low ruffle. But there was a muckraker by the name of Jack Anderson, who was pretty well known as a syndicated columnist, who decided to publish a story on this called The Voodoo Warriors of the Pentagon. And so I'm sitting at my desk, literally in the bowels of the Pentagon, and this lieutenant colonel comes roaring in and going like, did you write this article? I said, yeah, I wrote the article. Don't you know the clearance process for getting it? And it just so happened that I had the paper with me. And on the desk, he had identified the office he was from, actually Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence for the Army. And I go, yeah. Is this you? You're off. Oh, the eagle's roaring off. Well, flappings hit the fence. By the way, fast forward a number of years later, I'm now with INSCOM, and we're having a session where we're teaching metal bending, and we can get into how and why we do that. And this guy raises his hand and he says, did you write that article? I said, yeah. I says, would you like to meet the guy who's cleared it?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Apparently had lost a bit of his ass.
Wow.
After that, I went back on it, because at that time, of course, I forget the name it was at that time, but the program was classified, and we had no admission that we were working in those areas.
So how does, and again, I know very little about remote viewing. What is the process with a remote viewer? Walk us through the steps of that.
We haven't got enough time.
Okay,
it's literally I'll give you the condensed version. Somewhat has historical perspective, and that is that you have to understand the intelligence. This is from the military perspective. It's now transitioned to totally civilian. By the way, caveat emptor. There's a host of folks out there. Some of them are pretty good. There's only two that I would personally, recommend. Be careful of who you get to. It was amazing how many people came out of the woodwork. And I was in the. We know who everybody was. It was a pretty small group, but as it evolved, as you know, the concept of the matrix was derived by Ingo Swann. And that was that there was a mental level you could get in there and mentally move to any place in time or space. Time is the one that I think is quite critical there. And so, well, initially what they would do is give geographic coordinates and go out and say, what's at this geographic coordinate? And the skeptic said, obviously, you memorize the entire grid system of the world. Somebody is
Of course.
and get out there. Now, you could tell kind of roughly, is it up north? Is it, that sort of thing. So what Ingalls came up with this system of coordinate remote viewing, where you would take arbitrary numbers and assign them as kind of mental markers to the objective that you want. And of course, normally the person who's doing the remote is totally blind. So it could be any place in time or space, what the target may be. And you ask them to mentally, and there's a process, starts out with, kind of squiggly lines, and it gets, one of the things that people should know is it takes a lot of work. You don't just sit down and, like Paul Smith likes to say, yeah, this is not TV in your brain.
Right.
You look down here and the program is running and all of that. So information is derived, and then they would take and have, the external reviewers would look at it. Frequently, the person who was queuing the session did not know the target either, and you did that so there was no way they could, bleed the information either intentionally or unintentionally guide the person who's doing the viewing. And they hate it when I say this, but sometimes it works. And there are mechanisms that you can use to enhance the probability of the aspect. There's a controversy. There's an individual, a civilian, Stephen Schwartz, who had a private organization that did some very, very work. Now, Stephen's approach is to have multiple remote viewers and look for coincidence of information. And, the highest probability based on you got a number of people reporting it. I might mention that people want to look it up because he's done some various, we did a 2050 project looking at the future of what 2050 would look like. And he will tell you that basically all of that has already come to pass, and now looking at 2060, that's out there. I'll let people search that out, but it's available probably on the internet or his podcast. So that was one approach, was using a consensus of numerous viewers. Another, Joe McMoneagle, who you probably know is Remote Viewer 001, was a very positive, good friend. His approach was, now it says you really want one good psychic, and the problem is that if you have a really strong viewer, that these other viewers are really hooking onto his signal, and so they can be led astray if the thing is missing. But it's again has now become big business, and there's IRVA, I should mention, International Remote Viewing Association. I was one of the founding members, but many of the top names in the field were there. Hal and Russell Targ, of course, Paul Smith. Can't go through all of them, but
Sure.
It has continued, and now is something you can again hook online and find courses that teach some aspect of it.
Fascinating. Totally fascinating. Okay, moving on here. Now, the big bombshell was from David Grush this summer with his testimony in front of the House Oversight Committee. So here's a clip from that.
Mr. Grush, finally, do you believe that our government is in possession of UAPs?
Absolutely, based on interviewing over 40 witnesses over 4 years.
And where?
I know the exact locations, and those locations were provided to the Inspector General.
Now, I understand that part of your early research, you came to the conclusion that there was not any sort of hidden program or crash retrieval program. So I'm curious, so following the testimony from David Grush, have you changed your mind regarding your earlier conclusions that there are no UFO programs, crash retrieval programs, that sort of thing?
I am really caught in the middle on this because, as we discussed, another reason I say that, and as you know, at the SALT conference, they had Grush in, and well, not in, he actually did a Zoom session. The reason I came to the original conclusion was based on my firsthand information. Now, I mentioned earlier that I talked to the director or deputy director of all those three-letter agencies and a number of other people. The information was always consistent. We mentioned Edward Teller was a personal friend. I had met him at Los Alamos, literally had him over for dinner to talk about these issues. And the thought on this was that if Roswell's real and 5 people are involved, Teller's probably one of them. And the rationale for that is he is, remember this 47, you can go back and look at Oppenheimer and that. So, Teller and Oppenheimer are on opposite. In fact, they built Sandia Lab for Teller because he was going for nuclear fusion as opposed to the fission bombs that were early on. So that is the most intensive energy known to man at the time. And my position has always been, if this is real, it ain't about little widgets flying around. It's understanding, a fundamental different source of energy, which changes the world dynamics geopolitically. I don't think he was BSing me. I did not have it. He didn't go, no, this is nonsense at all. I actually was interested. He found the Cash Landrum case to be most interesting because that has a radiation component to it, which is an area that he knew. Now, going beyond Teller, so he's, again, I've got, I might mention one of these agencies, the director of one of those agencies, he and I were actually sitting on an advisory board to U.S. SOCOM. So I had a chance to talk to him about this in some depth and specifically about the topic. Did not seem to have that. When I did the study, I finally got to, it was unfunded. That's where I give Lou credit. With OSAP, they were able to actually get some money. Although I got to tell you, in Pentagon terms, 20 million is, we're talking
nothing.
lunch change, okay? Well, there's an implication there that goes all the way back to the Condon report, because remember, that ended Blue Book. Everybody thought that was a big, intensive study, and in fact, it started around $250,000. It was literally a couple $100K, got plussed up a little bit, but we are talking under $500,000 for that study. So that's just to put it in perspective. And one of the misconceptions was, and by the scientific community specifically, was that this was an in-depth, really intensive study. In fact, the report's pretty damn good, because while the conclusions are negative, if you read the internal parts of the report, there's some pretty good UFO reports that are both in Blue Book and in the Colorado Commission. So anyway, we decided, okay, it's time to transition, and I've gone up the food chain, and at this time, SDI, or what's colloquially known as Star Wars, was the biggest program that was going. And we said, okay, time to transition. Let's go and see if we can't formalize this and get some money. And again, it was a $5 billion program, which was, again, very hefty. the biggest in DOD at the time. So through a general officer friend, a meeting was set up, and General Abramson attended. He probably doesn't even remember this, frankly, but so had the report. I had an entourage from various agencies, and he uncharacteristically did not know the topic before we got there. Now, normally, when you brief at these levels, you're probably familiar in the other governmental sectors. I mean, you go into principles, you send in a read ahead so that they know what the topic is and they're smart enough to be able to ask the right questions and not look dumb and all that. That did not transpire here. So I went in. We went around the room and said who we were, where we were from, and that. And at that time, I was from Laboratory Command. Again, this was something that was my day job. Again, doing all that high tech stuff. So we went around the room, and then I started in like this with UFO 101. And really starting with just, what are we talking about? Something beginning to get to the key. And he goes, whoa. Who are you guys really? I mean, So went back around the room and said the various agencies they were from, CIA and NSA were there, and others. So I went back and did this thing, and my notion is this is like a deer caught in the headlights. I mean, no idea what we were talking about. But you got to remember, again, the biggest program, about to put weapons in space. We figure if anybody needs to or would know about such a thing, this is the area that would be. So went on for more than an hour or so, and finally got on it, and he says, look, and I had made the pitch that says, okay, we would like to, formalize the program. And he goes, look, you got my attention, but I can't touch this. He said, if I get caught doing this, he said, and the quote was, I'm doing some hairy stuff now. I'm not sure exactly what that was, but, SDI was really pushing the envelope in technology. And he says, but if I get caught doing this, they're going to crucify me. And wow. Being that big a program, if you know how Washington works, well, one of my quick, cheap things I always liked when I was in the building, the Pentagon, people say, I'm going to find money. Now, when you say there are no pots of money, sitting in the hallways to pick up. What it means is I'm reading somebody else's program. Well, his program, SDI, was already the target for everybody who wanted money. And what you would do is use this as an excuse. Like, if they got money for this, they're obviously got too much money. So this is, again, when you get into the thinking on this and has it changed? Yeah. But my experience, and this is where it's different, and I'm still waiting, hopefully from Grush, said absolutely no. Now, there's one other key piece to this. There was a guy by the name of Dean Judd. And Dean was a good friend of mine, and he was the technical director for SDI. And he had come from Los Alamos, which is how I had met him. And I actually brought Dean to the board for NIDS. I brought him on a board to Special Operations Command as well. We spent hours and hours and hours talking about these sorts of things. And I have no reason to believe that he was BSing me. And, now, what I will tell people is there were times that I stepped on toes with him where I'd ask about certain technology and he'd go, we're not discussing that. So we understood there were certain parameters. Now, not only was Dean the technical director for SDI, after that, he was the NIO for Science and Technology. NIO stands for the National Intelligence Officer. Now, this is before the days of DNI. So the director of CIA was dual-hatted. He was both the director of CIA and the director of Central Intelligence. The point here is there was a small, what's called the IC staff, the Intelligence Community staff at the time, because you can't go to the president and say, well, DIA thinks this, but NSA has this opinion, CIA, you've got to go in, when you're going at the presidential level, you've got to go in with a coordinated position. He was the guy that did that. He was the guy who, again, for all science and technology, was the guy at the top. New space architecture is inside out. Literally up until I was talking to up until 2 days before he died, and no indication of this. And again, I had pushed things that he said, yeah, no, we're not talking about that. And I said, okay, I understand. There are certain areas that, I haven't got tickets for that, so again, my firsthand experience on it, I mentioned to you when you were talking on the phone, Ben Rich was involved. Now, Ben was the head of Skunk Works, and that's one of the agencies everybody says, has the material and is doing the development. If so, he definitely lied to me because we talked about these topics explicitly. Mm-hmm. I had also, when I brought him to Los Alamos and had hosted him, coming in and talking about how the Skunk Works worked and all of that. Yeah, that's of course the end of one. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. But an awful lot of people lie to me. Conversely, and here's where I run into it, as you know, I've got some very high-level friends who come out and say, believe Grush. And they say, I know who was involved. And I did have somebody who was here. I've only met one person who has said, I know somebody who did work on it. All the rest of them have been a friend of a friend. So I'm like a lot of people. I kind of hope they're right.
Right.
But again, my position on this has never been on widgets. And you find too many people we're flying. Said, if we understood UFOs, you understand a fundamental different source of energy, and that changes the dynamics of the world. In fact, in one of my books, I use 0 point energy as an example, but it says we just make the Middle East irrelevant, changes everything, so that you could have something that could fly is interesting, but almost inconsequential.
Do you think that could possibly be one of the key reasons why the United States government has hidden this from Congress and the American people, or do you think it's much more multifaceted than just a couple of reasons?
Well, that assumes that they have. And that's where I come down to, I'm not sure. I would have said no, and I can explain Roswell without UFOs. But again, if it weren't these other folks that I know that I highly respect who say, yeah, it's real, because it does run contrary. One of the guys we mentioned earlier, Edgar Mitchell, was a friend, and he was a proponent. And he was very clear that when he was in NASA, he never had any information about UFOs or anything like that. Some names, they've all since transitioned, but there was a guy by the name of Bob Kupperman, whom I'd met at Los Alamos. He was the senior guy at CSIS, again, a think tank in Washington. We used to meet periodically. Met his wife, Helen. And Helen had been with NASA as a lawyer when we developed the space treaty, and was very clear. We were talking about UFOs. I forget the exact time frame, probably been early 90s, but the treaty was done back in the 60s. And her comment to me was, look, don't think we didn't think about this. We did. And we set up procedures. And in fact, it's, if you look up in the treaty, I've got it in one of my books there, but if ET, immediate release of information to UN and worldwide dissemination, which would mean that if Grush and all the rest of them are true, they're in violation of international law. And my position on it would be that if they've done this, it's tantamount to treason.
Absolutely. Now, most Americans, as we know, believe UFOs exist. Let's say that the government confirms its existence, so or the phenomenon.
Wait.
Go ahead.
The government has never said they don't exist. That's one of the misnomers. They have been saying UFOs are real since at least the 50s. They've never said don't exist. And that's very different from we're not involved. But they've never been, and I know the UFO community thinks the government's denied it. They really haven't been denied it. And you go back, one of the classic examples that you're familiar with, I'm sure, is the Twining memo.
Right.
And yeah, that was initially classified, but that's also kind of critical to me. If you look at the Twining memo, it was initially secret, but it was designed from the Chief of Staff of Intelligence to all the people. And it said, UFOs are real. This is not a mirage of the hallucinations. Take it. What it does not say is, oh, by the way, we got some of those. And it is written just after the Roswell incident. By the way, Roswell, I'm convinced, happened. I don't think there's any doubt that there was, some significant event there. What it was, well, that's where we get into, and I'm not denying that all these these people have come to me and said, yeah, it's real, they did hide it, and but I'd say my firsthand evidence doesn't support it.
So going back to to what you were talking about, saying that the government has never denied it, I would say though that as far as like the general population, they feel, or I would say that the perception is that the government has never confirmed it. Like no, president hasn't stepped out on the podium and said this exists. We don't know where it's from, etc. So my question with that, if that happens and they essentially confirm what everyone knows, do you think it's going to make a bit of a difference to the average American household? I would think that as long as they can put food on the table and go to their kids' soccer games, they'll be like, yeah, we always knew.
You just answered. I was going to say, what's for dinner?
Yeah.
No, for most of them, people do believe that they exist and are there, but what's for dinner is far more important. And if they came out and said this, I don't think it's, well, I'll tell you another war story. Back in the NIDS days, we were looking at we almost got congressional hearings. And they got destroyed with Greer and company coming out. But we were working on that. And I met with the congressman and I said, can you take a 20-point hit in the polls? And he said, yeah, I think I can. Now, he's since been voted out. But the point was that at that time, he was very, very secure. And the reason I asked, can you take a 20-point hit in the polls? Now, we're talking again 30 years ago, but a friend of mine was Senator Claiborne Pell. And Pell was interested in the topic. And when he came up for re-election, they used the topic against him. That, oh, you're interested in weird shit, and he did take a 20-point hit in the poll. So I wasn't guessing as to what the public response would be. Now, I was also told by a staffer of his, the opponent was actually a supporter, but used it purely from a political standpoint because he knew that he hurt. And by the way, this literally followed him to his grave. And if you look up Pell's obituary in the Washington Post, it talks about, no, what he had done is MUFON had a meeting in Washington, and he did stop by for a day sometime on that. But you will literally find in the obituary, in a very negative term, that it was that he had UFO. You find the same thing, by the way, with Bob John, who was the dean of School of Engineering at Princeton, who has set up the Paralab. And again, I mean, literally follow you to your grave. And unnecessarily so. I mean, at that point, what's the point of trying to denigrate somebody? But it was viewed that negatively fairly recently.
Now, backing up earlier, you mentioned that you guys nearly had congressional hearings, but that was derailed by Stephen Greer and company. What occurred there?
They held their thing. Well, first of all, there were a number of people who were supportive on that, but a lot of them were, but don't mention my name. And in my UFO book, I actually wrote the introductory statement. I forget what all it is, but there are appendices in the book because I actually wrote where we were going to go. At that time, Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin had the chair of science and technology, and he was no way in hell I'm going to let that happen on my watch. But we also knew that he was probably going to be reelected, but he wanted to go to judiciary, so we just wait him out. But then Greer came in with all of his people, and their approach was nasty government, nasty, you're evil, this is not the way to gain support in these kind of sensitive areas. And as soon as the 91, 92, whatever the hearings were, I mean, all support just went away. But we are not touching that.
Now, with someone with your military and intelligence background, do you consider UFOs a national security threat? And do you think our government is concerned about publicly, coming forward and really making a statement about it, that it would precipitate a reaction from the phenomenon?
This is an area where I have changed. Actually, in my book, UFOs, Myths, Conspiracy, and Realities, at the end, I talk about two potential threat areas. One of them is national security. The other is aviation safety. I've actually come down to probably no, but that does not mean UFOs should not be investigated.
Bless you. My allergies have been going
Sorry
crazy.
about that. The sidewalks are yellow here with a pollen content.
Oh, yeah.
I'll give you my analogy, and we had discussed this offline before, and that is if you something at least as complex as cancer. And when you look at the role of government and say in cancer, they have a role, in some cases kind of leading in some areas, but not the role. meaning the technology or the application, the study of cancer and cancer drugs is oncology is very widespread. I see the same thing with the UFO perspective, in that obviously they've had some interactions. The government has the role in understanding what those sorts of interactions are. But again, I think everybody knows now this is a global phenomenon, and it goes back millennia. So from a other governmental perspective, there are people, obviously, a number of folks that are interested in it. If there is an aviation threat, and that's where most of these the reports come in. You probably do want to know about that. Conversely, if you're a manager of any governmental agencies, the money you're spending is, U.S. taxpayer money. So the question from that perspective is, how much money or national resources are you willing to commit, and particularly to a topic that you have a very low probability of coming up with definitive answers to? And that's one where you really could hold, anybody at any level, particularly in the executive branch, they're going to commit funds, and you say you're looking for ROI. I think, well, as you know, the first line of my UFO book is UFOs are real. I mean, in a very physical sense. The last paragraph is, whatever this is, it is more complex than we can possibly imagine. So, given the complexity of the topic, do you want to have your finger, a conduit in to get the information, that sort of thing? Yeah, I think so. I think that, how much money are you going to spend on that? And that's one where you really could be taken to task as a manager, saying you're committing public resources. My guess is if you went out to the public, they'd probably come down overall again. And this is one of the key issues. And I think the UFO community, and probably the people who are watching this, have very little concept. This is not a voting issue. So you say, why aren't the politicians involved? Yeah, interest, maybe. This is nowhere when you get to, Gaza, the economy, Ukraine, healthcare, etc. And you really, again, from a geopolitical standpoint, have to take into account all of the things that are going on. I saw some recent chatter on some of these back channels that people who were talking to congressmen literally saying they don't answer my call anymore.
Wow.
So that has to do with what's the visibility, and can we approach this positively or not? But it's, again, not only is the technology terribly complex, certainly the politics are as well.
And that was going to lead me into my next question regarding the Schumer Amendment. As we know, the Schumer Amendment was pretty much stripped out. So with all of the things going on that you previously spoke about in Gaza and Ukraine and whatnot, do you think that there is going to be a second attempt at a revised Schumer Amendment? Or is it, they've got other bigger, more pressing things to focus on other than UAP?
Well, that's two different questions. Will there be an attempt? Probably. Will it pass? No.
No.
Again, from a political perspective, this is an easy one to trade away.
Got it. Now, at the Soul Foundation conference that we met at, former Army Colonel Carl Nell, he described catastrophic disclosure in a number of ways, and one of which was if a foreign adversary formally discloses first, say China or Russia. If that were to happen, would that do damage to the reputation of the United States?
Yeah, well, as you know, Carl sat next to me for the 2 days there. You may have seen that, and we discussed it and have continued since. And I just don't think so. I mean, consider the damage it's being to the U.S. reputation already. That I think this is probably in the noise level. Won't get off into politics, but that's where I write and spend most of my time now. It's well, first of all, you do keep seeing articles with saying, is it somebody else's? Are they doing it? The answer to that is no. I point out we had records of Mach 500 in 1957. Nobody in the world was doing anywhere close to that at that time. So this is not some foreign. Now there some foreign technologies that might be masked in there, and particularly as the whole UAV. And you also talk about USOs or subsurface things, and there are some credibility. Tim Gallaudet, very interested in the topic. But you also concurrently see a plethora of subsurface technologies coming along. If you watch the game into Ukraine, some of the things they've done against the ships in Crimea. So you have aerial drones, and you have subsurface drones and that sort of thing. That is going to muddy the waters. There's no doubt about it, and things you definitely need to know about. Does that explain it? Not the slightest, because again, the sightings go back decades, centuries, and eventually millennia.
Now, I have some audience questions. If you have, say, another 15 or 20 minutes to spare, would love to throw some questions your way from our viewers. All right,
fire away.
All right, fire away. So this question is from Frank Milburn, whom I think you know. Good afternoon, Colonel. Given increasing threats by Russia and China to the U.S.-dominated international rules-based system and liberal international economic order, plus increasing confessional, I think he meant congressional interest in UAP and associated technologies and threats, how likely do you see a consolidated American UAP exploration program to accrue the advantages before terrestrial adversaries do?
Very low. Now you go back to Reagan's speech, of course. And by the way, hi, Frank. He and I communicate on those fatty stuff. We
had him on last week. It was great.
Yeah, I know. And we've talked and friends and that. As Reagan said, it's an external threat, but I don't see the public in general seeing this as a potential threat. We're having problems at the moment just getting joint programs going, particularly inter-theater. This particularly does get into the geopolitical arena, but if you take things like Africa and what's happening there, as you know, I've been in North, South, and East Africa, and every place you go is China. In addition, you see the influence of Russia in these areas. We have a much larger terrestrial, very real threat here, and we're not paying attention to it. And I think much to our detriment. I point out, America first means America only, and it has been to a great detriment and very concerned about what happens with NATO in the future, and that. My guess is the day-to-day threats just overwhelm any kind of theoretical concerns about an intergalactic adversary. By the way, I also come down, just so you know, against the ETH, or the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And it's not because events don't occur. And I say there have been reports of interactions between humans and sentient non-human beings throughout the entirety of human history and in all cultures. So there's nothing new. My problem with the ETH, i.e. little green guys in Zeta Reticuli zipping in, or wherever that's where they're usually supposed to come from, just too simple. It does not explain all of the observations that we've seen. I'm now using a term that others have, but ultra-terrestrial, which looks at the interdimensional aspects, temporal aspects, just that they might fly across the way. By the way, all of those things get away with the problem how you get here from there.
Yeah, of course. And actually, I have a question from earlier. While you were at Los Alamos, of course, there's a long history of UAP being attracted to nuclear weapons facilities. While you were at Los Alamos, did you ever hear of anything floating above the skies above the lab that was unexplained?
No, and no discussion of the topic. People I would talk to who thought I was crazy, but who would talk about these topics, but nothing in personal observations and that. And so I know you've had Robert Hastings on, and I think the book on UFOs and nukes. What happens though in those areas is they tend to focus on those particular aspects, and they establish the reporting parameters and then find evidence to support it. I know Bob Salas, and I'm sure you know about all of the Northern Tier sightings and Faded Giant and all of those happened. So did a whole lot of other things. So
okay.
Is it related strictly to nukes? No. I mean, some suggest that was the first. You don't non-interference in a developing society. I think if ET came here, you'd find us rather primitive anyway. So.
That's for sure. Okay, Timar, great guest. Colonel Alexander is a super interesting person. Thank you for that. Lady Bentley, a question. Colonel Alexander, during your time in active duty, could you divulge how many CAPs and SAPs you've been involved in?
I don't know.
That's got to be a lot, I would think.
No, yeah, but here's actually what you're hitting on is a problem, not in this arena, but in many others, is, you get right into these various SAPs and things. What happens is when you retire, you get kind of a generic, don't talk about stuff, but you never get a follow-up that says, oh, by the way, this has now been released. You can talk about this or that. So once you just lose track of it all, and the answer is kind of a lot, but I couldn't even tell you what they are. I mean, again, I retired from the military in '88, from Los Alamos in '95. So it's been a while.
It has been a while. Okay, another question here. What do you think of reports that a major disclosure event will happen in the next 3 or 4 years?
Good luck.
Good luck, yeah.
Yeah, I hate to tie this to politics, but I think a lot happens there. I just think what's happening in the world today is going to eat our lunch. And this is, unless it's a direct threat or something that, again, impacts, are you going to be able to eat tonight? public is going to be consumed with day-to-day life.
I agree with that. Heiser Soze, does Colonel Alexander know Tim Taylor or have a Tim Taylor story, if you know Tim Taylor?
I don't know him. My only link is through Chris Bledsoe, and I do have an interesting Chris Bledsoe story if you want.
Please.
But are you familiar with him, first of all?
Yes, I've read his book.
Okay, well, I wrote, Jim Silverman and I wrote forwards for him. The story was that I had heard probably a decade or so ago now when I first heard about him, and I had interviewed him at a mutual friend's house. And then my wife and I went and we visited Chris in Hope Mills, North Carolina. He was living at a different place when he was at now. But he told us, and the story is long and involved, it literally takes hours to describe the whole story. But what happened was, after a couple of days, we went down to Cape Fear River where the initial event had taken place. And it was getting late in the afternoon. It was November, and it was kind of getting dark. So we had walked down. We had to park the car up above a gate, walked a couple hundred meters down to where the initial event had occurred. We came back up to the car. My wife and Emily, his daughter, got in the back seat of the car, and Chris and I are leaning against the fender. And he's describing, well, this happened here, and this UFO was over here, and that. And all of a sudden, he goes, "Oh, I think they're here."
Wow.
And a few seconds later, this thing pops into view and goes zipping off. And I saw that. And the point was, it was the temporal relationship between him saying, "I think they're here," and this object appearing. I didn't see any structure to it and all that. It was a bright light and suddenly there. But again, it was just within a very few seconds. Now, he and I made friends. Obviously, I wrote the forward for UFO of God. Talked to him as recently as this week. And the point here is that these occurrences are continuing to this very day. And there is definitely a mental connection to it. You can sense them and get them to respond. One of the things I put in the forward is it looks like this is some attempt at communication. The problem is we don't have the Rosetta Stone. I would mention in talking to Brandon Fugal, he feels the same way about the ranch, that it does appear that things are trying to communicate. Now, getting back to your original question, or the earlier question on, would it be a breakthrough? I think in the scientific community, if we did get the Rosetta Stone or we did get communications back and forth, there would be some more interest in that. But unless it disrupts daily life, it's not going to be critical.
Sage Sleuth here asks, in your view, is it ET or angels or demons? I know you were saying you think it's obviously not a simple answer.
Yeah, no, the answer, and this is why I went to the ultra-terrestrial. It doesn't mean there aren't ETs, but I think that only addresses a piece of the question. And as we said, there have been reports of interactions between humans and sentient non-humans throughout human history. Are there ghosts and things? We didn't get into after-death communication. That's an area that I'm working in at the moment. How do you transit the veil, if you will? And there seems to be some physical interaction. Just 2 weeks ago, today, as a matter of fact, I returned from Arthur Findlay College in the UK. It's in Essex, Stamford, and that's where they teach mediums. And these folks, well, we had about 45 in our group, and most of them were practicing mediums. We went because my wife was interested and now is doing communication. You go, well, communication with what, with who, are there physical things? Probably opening up, after death communication and life after death issues is a whole different topic. But remember, that's kind of where I came in on, well, not really, but was deeply involved in these areas. Certainly believe that there's some, talking with Gary Schwartz, who's kind of the key researcher in these after-death communication and with mediums. And one of the questions he had to me is, well, are we talking about angels? Are there archangels? And, a whole hierarchy and whatnot. And again, by the way, I would mention Eben Alexander, who is not a relative of any kind, but I put great credence in his story because he was a neurosurgeon for 25 years, thought all this stuff was nonsense before he had his own NDE, but talks about he spent almost a week in deep coma.
Wow.
There's just phenomenological aspects to that. But and he says the problem was in his out-of-body NDE state, he understood how everything fit together, but when you come back, that all disappears.
Went away.
Yeah. And it's there's there's a couple of studies that I mentioned. I'm just throwing out some things. Mary Neal is another one, and where her story is, she's also another surgeon, by the way. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but she's in Chile kayaking, goes over cliff, and it goes underwater, is held there for, we think, 35 minutes. Her body, to get out of the kayak, her legs break above the knees and bend forward this way. Body is recovered downstream a bit. Then you bring it back up. Two guys appear, if you want, angels. We don't know where they were. They went back and looked for them, and physically they don't exist, but they were in human form. And they took her body out to the waiting ambulance. And this is an area of Chile that does not have ambulances. And yet there it is waiting on the road, and, highly, highly corroborated. So these stories get just amazing. As a matter of fact, I had lunch 2 days ago with Vinnie Tolman, who happens to live here, and he's one who was absolutely dead. We know until he gets shocked for 45 minutes, he's literally in a body bag being taken off. They shock and recover a heart. They put him on life support systems, but his EEG is flatlined for 3 days, and then just revives and has, amazing stories to tell about it. But not UAPs, but
right.
But when you get into this issue of other entities, because in Vinny's case, he had a guide who showed up and took him, told him a bunch of things, and had him survive. And the story was, he said, "What do I call you?" He says, "Are you Jesus?" And he says, "No, you can call me Drake." So, well, now there's a reason. So what happens is, so he revives, and a couple of years later, he's attending a family reunion in Afton, Wyoming, and they're doing this play, and they talk about the founders of this small Mormon community, and there's a picture, and he talks to his grandmother, and the guy's name was Clarence something. It was Clarence D. something. And he says, "Do you know about him?" He says, "Oh, you mean Grandfather Drake?" and had been his real grandfather. So,
Wow.
yeah, don't know how wild you want to get, but it dramatic.
Okay, this is from Julie Farrell. Do you think that the phenomenon could possibly be part of the Earth's operating system, consciousness?
I would ask if she knows of John Lilly. Are you familiar with Lilly? I don't know, before I get off too far. It was Lilly on dolphins and that, because he had a thing called the ECHO, which was the Earth Coordinating Control Office. But then he also had the Solar System Coordinating Control Office and the Cosmic Coincidence Control Office that was, coordinating all of these things. Is Gaia real? Do we interact? One of the things we have not discussed that I think is critically important, and that's the role of consciousness and the thoughts on consciousness, in that the materialistic view is that the brain is here and consciousness is created by the brain. But if you go back in history, like Max Planck in particular, use that quote as the Max Planck Institute was what they were saying over a century ago. Consciousness is fundamental. You cannot get behind consciousness, and are suggesting that the physical arises from consciousness as opposed to the other way around, that consciousness being derived in the mind. And I don't think that the brain and the mind are the same at all.
Okay, question here from Todd T. Oh, Todd T, thank you very much for the super chat. I appreciate that. Great guest, he says. Thanks. Another one from D-Rod. Thank you for the super chat. What does Colonel Alexander think of Dr. James Lukatsky's quote, the government has at least one craft and we've breached the whole?
I don't know. Again, of course, Cullum, I've known, Cullum and George are both friends, and I have not met Lukatsky. I find the statement, very, very interesting. But if when they followed up, will you say more about that? The answer was no. We just cut the conversation off at there, which I think is, very, very detrimental to society. This stuff is real. It definitely needs to be out. I think it's going to lead to more orders of complexity. The idea that they got in is not new. I had actually heard this decades ago. But one of the things that they said that was real is had gotten in and looked up, and then when you went inside, the volume was like football fields in a craft that's only 30 feet or so across. And you go, how that? So then you are clearly manipulating time, space in a way that we do not understand.
Okay, let's see here. A question from Peter Stone. Has a colonel heard of the group called the Aviary? And if so, clearly you do, because he wants to know if you have an opinion about them.
Well, I can tell you I am not the Penguin.
The Penguin? All right, now I'm stumped.
You'll find writing out there that says I was the Penguin. The reality is that I was given a name, and there were three of us. Hal Putoff, Scott Jones, and myself when we were up near Wright Pat. And the point was the aviary was just a thing that Moore and Chandray wanted to talk about on the phone. and not use real name. But the problem was they often assigned the name over the phone, so if anybody was listening, they would have known, who it is anyway. But
Right.
was there an aviary, or did an aviary ever meet? No, nor was there an aquarium. But pretty familiar with most of the conspiracy theories that are out there.
But
Find
you're
them frankly laughable.
and you're definitely not the penguin.
I'm definitely not the penguin. You will find that someplace on the net.
Oh,
I think it was on the Pentagon's Penguin or something like that.
oh wow. All right. So a final question here from Antonio Pizzella. How does the Colonel feel about us losing his generation of secret keepers? And does he think there will be any end-of-life statements?
Well, there already have been. If you follow the thing, that's happened several times and generally been discounted. Also, some of the ones that, his name is Lieutenant Hout, from Roswell, and you say it was not a deathbed confession, as they've been trying. I had talked it some time before. Well, I mean, this stuff keeps coming out. The problem is lack of cooperation. That's what we're waiting for. Like I said, I've had to make a major shift in thinking as to accepting the possibility that I was really, really wrong. And again, these very senior people say I'm really, really wrong, but people who were more senior to them earlier said I was right. So again, my first-hand experience is no. Secondhand says, there's more to it. And as I said, if they're right, this is literally criminal.
It absolutely is. Well, Colonel, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to put links to your books. I think you've written, 5? Is that right so far?
Yeah. Well, the one that would probably be of most interest, well, there's 2. One, the UFOs. The other one, Reality Denied, where we talk about things that we've encountered all over the world. There's a whole section there on being dead and post-mortem communication and those sorts of things. So.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you spending your Easter Sunday with us. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting. I hope I get the pleasure of meeting you again in person and having further discussions, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, now.
Okay. Have a great Sunday.
Bye.
All right, folks, if you enjoyed our show, we would appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. And of course, please tell your friends about us on social media. The best way for us to get the word out about our show is by you telling your friends. The more people that watch, the more we can spread our message on what we think is a very vital topic, the whole UAP, UFO thing. And as always, if you enjoyed this program, we would love for you to hit the subscribe button and comment. And we're also slow to build our following on Twitter, which on Twitter you can find us at Good Trouble Show. And of course, we would appreciate your follow there. And we hope everyone has a great Easter Sunday. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you. Actually, we're not going to see you this coming week. We're going to be off for about 10 days, maybe a bit longer, but we will be back with some great guests. And thanks again for tuning in, and see you soon on The Good Trouble Show.